Hey, welcome to HOA Karen Cases.
The road thins out long before it disappears. That's how I knew this place wasn't meant to be found. I didn't come here to escape. I came here to draw a line. Silence worked until someone decided silence was a problem. When authority can't categorize you, it starts watching. She didn't argue the land. She argued her right to interpret it. That's when paperwork turned into presence. And presence became pressure. Power speaks loudly. Records speak forever. The road thins out long before it disappears. That was the first thing I'd loved about this place. Asphalt gives way to gravel, gravel to dirt, and eventually even GPS gives up, like it knows it isn't welcome anymore. Every mile out feels like shedding weight, noise, urgency, the constant sense that someone is watching or waiting for you to slip. By the time I turn onto the final stretch, there's nothing but trees pressing in from both sides and the low hum of tires rolling over stone. No streetlights, no sidewalks, no uniform mailboxes lined up like teeth. Just land that doesn't care if you're late. That's why I bought it, not as an escape, as a boundary. The property sits just far enough outside the neighborhood grid to feel separate, but close enough to technically fall within the broader HOA zone. That balance mattered to me. I wanted privacy without isolation, quiet without disappearing completely, the kind of place where days could pass without interruption. And when someone did show up, it meant something. The land itself was never flashy, no manicured entrance, no ornamental fencing. Trees formed their own perimeter, uneven and unapologetic. The house sat back from the road, partially hidden, like it was trying not to be seen. When I first walked it with the surveyor years ago, he joked that it looked like a property designed to avoid attention. He wasn't wrong. I knew exactly where every boundary line ran. I had the survey, the county records, the deed copies stamped and re-stamped over decades. I'd done my homework before signing anything. This land wasn't ambiguous to me. It was measured, documented, and boring in the best possible way. The HOA, on the other hand, thrived on ambiguity. I'd never been the kind of person who needed to fight them. I followed the rules that applied to me. Setbacks respected, structures permitted, landscaping left natural, as allowed under the environmental carve-out written into the bylaws. One of those sections most people never read because it didn't apply to their neat little lawns. I wasn't rebellious, I was invisible. I didn't attend meetings, I didn't volunteer, I didn't join committees or neighborhood groups. I paid dues on time, replied when required, and otherwise stayed out of the way. That silence wasn't accidental. It was intentional. I'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to attract the wrong kind of attention was to either resist loudly or participate too eagerly, so I did neither. For a while, that worked. The first letter arrived late spring, tucked neatly into my mailbox like it belonged there. White envelope, HOA letterhead, a printed signature at the bottom, Karen. At the time, she was just a name. HOA president, efficient, polite. The kind of tone that reads friendly until you look closely and realize every sentence is structured to assert authority without ever stating it outright. The letter thanked me for being a compliant homeowner, reminded me of seasonal guidelines, mentioned nothing specific, no accusations, no warnings, just presence. I remember setting it on the kitchen counter and going about my day. No reaction, no irritation, certainly no concern. If anything, I took it as confirmation that staying quiet was still working. The second letter came a month later, still polite, still professional, but narrower. It referenced properties on the outer boundary and the importance of maintaining visual consistency. There was no violation listed, just a suggestion to review guidelines. I reread that one twice. Visual consistency was an interesting phrase. My property had never been visually consistent with the neighborhood. That was the point. Trees don't trim themselves into HOA-approved shapes, and no one had ever required them to. I didn't respond. The third letter came after a summer storm. This one arrived in a plastic sleeve, taped to the inside of my mailbox door. That was new. It wasn't aggressive, but it was intentional. Someone had driven out here to place it where I couldn't miss it. Karen's name was at the bottom again. This time, the tone had shifted. Still courteous. Still technically compliant. But threaded through the paragraphs was an assumption that bothered me. a subtle ownership of space she didn't have, language that implied oversight, jurisdiction, expectation. I stood there for a while after reading it, the door still open, wind moving through the trees like it always had. Nothing about the land had changed. Nothing about my compliance had changed. Something about their attention had. That was when I first felt it. The sense that my quiet wasn't being interpreted as neutrality. It was being interpreted as resistance. The realization didn't come with fear. It came with clarity. People who are comfortable with their authority don't need to test it. They don't send letters without cause. They don't show up uninvited, even politely to remind you they exist. I'd lived long enough to recognize the pattern. Silence makes certain personalities uneasy, especially the kind that measure control by participation. I didn't know Karen yet. Not really. Just her name, her tone, the way her letters occupied space without permission. But I could already tell she didn't like that I hadn't given her anything to work with. No complaints, no requests, no reactions. Nothing is more frustrating to a control-oriented system than a compliant outlier. A week later, I noticed a car slow down near the tree line. It didn't stop, just rolled past, slow enough to observe, fast enough to pretend it wasn't. I didn't recognize it, but I recognized the behavior, someone cataloging what didn't fit. That night, rain moved in heavy and steady, drumming against the roof in a way that usually calmed me. I sat by the window, watching water gather and slide off leaves, thinking about how absurd it was that a place this quiet could provoke anyone. But power doesn't need noise to feel threatened. It just needs something it can't categorize. The next morning, I pulled my property file from the cabinet for the first time in years. Not out of panic, out of habit, survey, deed, HOA bylaws, environmental exemptions. Everything exactly where it should be. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was confirming I wouldn't need one. Still, as I slid the folder back into place, I understood something had shifted. The calm here wasn't gone, but it was being watched, measured, interpreted by people who mistook absence for defiance. Karen hadn't shown her face yet, but her presence was already outlining the conflict. And I had the feeling, quiet, steady, unmistakable, that she was going to need more than letters to resolve whatever discomfort my silence had created. The first time I saw Karen in person, it wasn't planned, at least not on my end. I was walking the fence line on the east side of the property, checking a section where last winter's rain had softened the ground. The sky was clear that morning, the kind of quiet blue that makes you forget other people exist. I'd just finished measuring a stretch near the tree break when I heard footsteps where footsteps didn't usually happen. Gravel crunching, slow, deliberate. I turned and saw her approaching from the road. Clipboard tucked under one arm like it belonged there. Karen. She smiled the way people do when they expect to be welcomed. "Good morning," she said, stopping just short of the fence. "I'm Karen, HOA president." Her tone wasn't rude. It wasn't warm either. It was practiced, friendly enough to disarm, firm enough to remind you she wasn't asking permission to be there. I nodded, staying where I was. "Morning." She glanced past me, eyes scanning the land behind the house, the trees, the distance. I noticed she didn't ask if this was a good time. "I've been meaning to introduce myself," she said. "Your property is unique." That word again. Unique is what people say when something doesn't fit the system they're used to. "I've lived here a while," I replied, neutral, polite, nothing to grab onto. Karen smiled tighter. "Yes, I've seen the records." That was my first internal pause. Not alarm, just awareness. Records meant she'd already formed an opinion before walking up to my fence. She flipped her clipboard open, tapping a page with her pen. "We've had some questions come up about boundary compliance and land use on outer properties." "Questions from who?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. "The HOA has a responsibility to ensure uniform standards." I looked down at the ground between us, then back at her. "Which standard are you referring to?" Karen hesitated for half a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. "Well," she said, "the landscaping guidelines for one, and the setback alignment." "That setback was surveyed before I bought the place," I said. "It's county approved." "I'm sure," she replied quickly, "but HOA standards can be more specific." That's when it happened. That feeling I'd had reading her letters crystallized into something sharper. because she wasn't talking about rules anymore. She was talking about interpretation. I gestured lightly toward the fence post nearest us. That line hasn't moved in decades. Karen glanced at it, then back at her clipboard, like the land itself was less authoritative than whatever was printed in her hands. Our maps show... Which maps? I asked. Again, that pause. The HOA planning overlays, she said. They're based on the original development. I almost smiled. Almost. The original development had stopped 3 properties short of mine. That wasn't opinion. That was recorded history. I've got the county survey, I said calmly. And the deed. I'm sure you do, Karen replied, her voice still smooth. But HOA governance doesn't always align perfectly with county records. That was the moment her words stopped matching the ground we were standing on. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her outright. I just listened. People reveal more when you let them keep talking. Karen went on about consistency, about expectations, about how properties like mine sometimes fall through the cracks. The way she said it made it sound like a problem that needed fixing. I noticed how she avoided specifics. No rule numbers, no citations. Just general authority language delivered with confidence. When I asked for clarification, actual sections, actual guidelines, she deflected. We can review that later, she said. This is just an informal check-in. Informal check-ins don't require clipboards. I looked past her at the road, then back at the fence. I prefer formal communication in writing. Her smile tightened again. Of course, transparency is important. But her eyes didn't agree. She stepped back, closing the clipboard. I'll follow up. I'll look for it, I said. Karen lingered a moment longer, as if expecting me to say something else, to explain, to justify, to invite her in. I didn't. Eventually, she turned and walked back toward the road, heels crunching against gravel like punctuation marks. I stood there long after she was gone, replaying the conversation in my head. Not emotionally, logically, word choice, avoidance. The way she spoke as if authority existed because she believed in it strongly enough. I went inside and pulled the folder again. Survey first. Clean, clear, boundary lines marked and verified. Deed next. Matching descriptions, no ambiguity. HOA bylaws last. I read them slower this time, not skimming for relevance, but searching for overreach. That's when I noticed it. A clause buried deep in the enforcement section. Vague language about supplemental interpretation that depended entirely on board discretion. It wasn't illegal, but it was flexible. Dangerous in the wrong hands. Karen wasn't confused. She was improvising. And improvisation only works when the other side isn't paying attention. That night, I opened a notebook I hadn't used in years and wrote down the date, the time, the exact phrases she'd used. Not because I planned to use them immediately, but because I'd learned the value of memory backed by ink. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew one thing with certainty. Karen's rules didn't match the map, and eventually one of them was going to be forced to change. Karen didn't bring it up right away. That's what made it stick. Our next interaction happened a week later, mid-afternoon, when the sun sat high enough to flatten shadows and make everything feel exposed. I was in the driveway unloading supplies when I heard her voice before I saw her. "Busy as always," she said. I turned. She was standing just beyond the property line this time, arms folded, sunglasses on. No clipboard, no pretense of inspection. This wasn't official. This was conversational. "At least out here," I replied. She smiled. "That's what I mean. You keep to yourself." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't praise either. It was observation. The kind people make when they're still deciding what you are. We talked about nothing at first. Weather, the road condition after the last rain. Small, safe things. I noticed she let the silences stretch, like she was waiting for me to fill them. I didn't. Eventually, she circled back. "I wanted to follow up on our last conversation," she said, "about the boundaries." "I reviewed my documents," I replied. "Everything's in order." "I'm sure you believe that," she said lightly. There it was again, that subtle undermining. Not disagreement, dismissal. I kept my tone even. "If there's a specific violation, I'll need it in writing." Karen nodded like she expected that answer. "Of course. We just like to resolve things informally when possible." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, My husband agrees. I looked at her. Your husband? She waved a hand. He's with the department. He deals with disputes all the time. The words were casual. The timing wasn't. That sentence landed heavier than anything she'd said so far. Not because it was overt, but because it didn't need to be. Oh, I said. Nothing else. Karen watched my face closely, gauging reaction. People who rely on implied power always do. They're listening for a change in breathing, a shift in posture, a flicker of uncertainty. I gave her none. He's very familiar with properties out here, she continued. Sometimes things get misunderstood. Misunderstood by whom? I felt a spark of anger then. Not hot, but sharp. The kind that demands discipline. Because once law enforcement enters a conversation that isn't about crime, the balance shifts whether anyone admits it or not. I'm sure he's busy, I said. This is a civil matter. Karen smiled again. Of course. I'm just saying we like to keep things neighborly. There it was, the threat wrapped in courtesy. I'd seen this tactic before, in other contexts, other places. Power introduced indirectly so it can be denied later. If challenged, she could say she was just making conversation. If effective, she'd never need to escalate. I let the silence sit. Karen shifted her weight. Anyway, she said, I'll be in touch. She turned and walked back toward her car without waiting for a response. I stood there long after the sound of her engine faded, staring at the road. My pulse had quickened, but not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was about leverage. That night, the wind picked up hard, rattling the windows and bending the trees into uneasy shapes. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, replaying the conversation in my head. Not emotionally, but mechanically. What was said, what wasn't, why it was said the way it was. Karen hadn't threatened me. She hadn't needed to. She'd simply introduced the idea that enforcement could extend beyond paperwork, that consequences might arrive wearing a uniform. That's when I understood something important. People who are confident in their authority don't need to borrow someone else's. Karen had. I slept poorly. Not because I was scared, but because my brain wouldn't shut off. Every scenario ran through my head, a cruiser pulling up just to check. Questions framed as concern, authority applied sideways instead of directly. By morning, the decision had already settled in me. If power was going to be implied, I was going to start documenting reality. I didn't confront her. I didn't email her. I didn't mention her husband at all. Instead, I made a list. Dates, times, interactions, exact phrasing. I checked my exterior cameras. Not to record her yet, but to understand angles, coverage, blind spots. I verified timestamps. Made sure logs were accurate. Not because something had happened, because something would. I also pulled the HOA bylaws again, this time focusing on enforcement limits, where authority stopped, where jurisdiction blurred, where discretion could be abused. The line was thinner than most people realized. Over the next few days, Karen stayed quiet. No emails, no letters, no surprise visits. That silence wasn't reassuring. It was strategic. The calm before someone decides whether to push or retreat. I caught myself listening more closely when cars passed the property, watching longer than usual, measuring the difference between vigilance and paranoia. PV self, I realized, was the real conflict at this stage. Fear would make me react. Anger would make me sloppy. Calm would make me dangerous in a way that mattered. By the end of the week, I had accepted something I hadn't wanted to. Karen wasn't managing the HOA. She was testing boundaries, mine and the system's. And by bringing her husband into it, even indirectly, she'd crossed a line she probably didn't realize existed. Because once a badge enters a personal dispute, documentation stops being optional. It becomes protection. I didn't know when the next move would come, but I knew who would make it. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that when it did, I would be ready. The envelope didn't look urgent. That was the strange part. No red ink, no bold warnings. Just the HOA letterhead in the corner and my name typed neatly across the front, like it had passed through 3 hands before it reached me. I stood at the mailbox longer than I needed to, holding it between my fingers, feeling that quiet click in my head that comes when something ordinary is about to turn complicated. Inside the house, I set it on the counter and finished what I was doing first. Coffee. Windows cracked open. the morning still cool enough to carry the smell of wet earth from the tree line. I told myself I wasn't avoiding it. I was pacing. When I finally opened the envelope, the paper slid out too easily. No inserts, no photos, just one page. Notice of violation. I read the first paragraph once, then again, slower. According to the letter, I had violated HOA landscaping guidelines by altering natural vegetation in a manner inconsistent with community standards. No date, no photograph, no specific location. Just a claim, complete and confident, followed by a deadline to remedy the issue. I stared at the words like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. I hadn't altered anything. Not recently. Not at all. The trees were the same trees that had been there when I bought the property. The brush line hadn't moved. No equipment, no contractors, no changes. Even the storm debris from last month was still stacked where I'd dragged it, within my own boundary, exactly as permitted. I read the letter again, this time paying attention to the tone. It wasn't inquisitive, it wasn't cautious. It didn't ask for clarification or suggest a misunderstanding. It assumed guilt the way a system does when it expects compliance to follow automatically. Karen's name sat at the bottom of the page. Printed, not signed. That detail mattered. I set the letter down and leaned against the counter, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for without admitting it. The point where implication turned into action. PV person had officially arrived. I didn't react right away. That was the first decision. No email, no call, no immediate response driven by irritation or disbelief. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I touched it, so I broke it down. The alleged violation referenced Section 8.3 of the HOA guidelines. I pulled the bylaws from my folder and flipped to the page. Section 8.3 addressed landscaping alterations within common visual corridors, areas visible from shared roadways and neighboring properties. My property didn't fall within any visual corridor. That wasn't interpretation, that was definition. Even if it did, the section required documentation, date, description, photographic evidence, and an opportunity to cure. None of that was present. The notice skipped straight to expectation. Procedure matters in places like this. HOAs don't have power because they're loud. They have power because they follow process. When they don't, their authority weakens in ways most people never notice until it's too late. I noticed. I sat at the table and drafted an email. Short. Professional. Emotionless. Hello, Karen. I received the violation notice dated today. Please provide the specific date, location, and documentation related to the alleged landscaping issue, as well as the relevant guideline citation. I'm happy to review once those details are available. Thank you. I read it twice before sending it. No accusations, no defensiveness, just a request for clarity. Then I waited. 2 days passed, the weather shifted, clouds rolling in, heavy and low, the kind that press against the trees and make the world feel smaller. I spent my time the way I always did. Maintenance, paperwork, walking the property. Nothing changed, no crews appeared, no damage revealed itself. On the third day, Karen replied. Her response didn't answer my questions. Instead, it was a block of copied HOA language about enforcement authority, discretion, and the importance of maintaining community standards. It concluded by reminding me of the compliance deadline. No date, no proof, no specifics. I read it once. Then again. Heat built slowly behind my eyes. Not rage. Something colder. The kind of anger that comes when someone assumes you won't push back. This wasn't oversight. It was pressure. PV society entered quietly here. Not the neighbors themselves, but the structure that spoke on their behalf. The board, the letterhead. The implication that I was out of step with the community, even though no one had complained to me directly. I replied again. Shorter this time. Karen, I can't address the notice without the requested details. Please advise. That was it. Her response came faster this time. Within the hour, she reiterated the violation, added that the HOA was within its rights to issue notices based on observation, and suggested I take corrective action proactively. Observation by whom? I leaned back in my chair and let the truth settle. This violation wasn't about landscaping, it was a test. They wanted to see if I'd comply without proof. if I'd trim, cut, or alter something, anything, just to demonstrate submission. They wanted movement, reaction, confirmation that the notice had teeth. I wasn't going to give them that. Instead, I started researching. I pulled past HOA meeting minutes from the shared portal, reading them the way people don't when they trust the system to be benign. Patterns emerged quickly, vague violations issued to outer properties. Enforcement language expanding without formal votes. Karen's name appearing more frequently, often attached to interpretive decisions. I checked county records next. My survey was still valid. No changes, no annexations, no overlays that would place my land under expanded HOA control. Everything lined up. Except their narrative. That's when I realized something that shifted the way I felt about the whole situation. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was manufacturing them, not by writing new ones, but by stretching old ones just far enough to see who would object. That night, the rain finally broke, hard and steady, soaking the ground, blurring the fence line into shadow. I stood on the porch and watched water carve paths through the dirt, thinking about how erosion works. Not all at once, slowly, quietly, 1 inch at a time. That's how authority overreaches. Not with a single dramatic grab, but with small assumptions no one challenges. Inside, I opened the notebook again. I wrote the date of the notice, the exact language, my response, her replies. I noted the lack of documentation. I didn't know yet how I'd use it. I just knew I would. The following morning, I checked my cameras. Not because I expected anything, but because I needed to know what observation might mean in Karen's vocabulary. No footage showed activity near my property line. No one walking, no cars stopping. Nothing. Which meant the violation was either fabricated or based on something so minor it couldn't withstand scrutiny. Either way, it didn't exist. By the end of the week, the deadline passed. I made no changes. I received no follow-up. That silence was louder than any threat. Because it told me the violation had served its purpose. It wasn't about resolution. It was about establishing dominance. When I didn't move, Karen paused, not retreating, just recalibrating. I understood then that this wasn't going to be resolved through emails or notices. Not yet. Karen had tested paperwork. Next, she'd test presence. And I had the uneasy certainty that when that happened, it wouldn't be another letter in my mailbox. It would be something heavier, something with wheels, something with authority painted on the side. I heard it before I saw it. The sound didn't belong out here. Engines usually announce themselves long before they reach my place. Tires easing over gravel, drivers slowing because the road demanded it. This sound was different, heavier, confident. Like whoever was driving assumed the ground beneath them was public by default. I was in the shed sorting tools when the noise cut through the trees, gravel popping, suspension creaking. I stepped out slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans, and that's when I saw it. The front end of a black and white cruiser easing past the tree line, sunlight flashing off the windshield in sharp, clinical bursts. A police car. On my land. For a split second, my brain searched for an explanation that didn't involve Karen. Lost officer, wrong turn, emergency reroute, anything that preserved normalcy. Then the car stopped. Not at the edge of the drive, not at the road. It stopped well inside my property line. My stomach tightened. Not in panic, but in that cold, sinking way that comes when something you anticipated still manages to hit harder than expected. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a move. The driver's door opened. He stepped out with the kind of ease that only comes from familiarity, uniform pressed, posture straight, one hand resting casually near his belt. He didn't look lost. He didn't look rushed. He looked comfortable. I didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Karen's husband. He glanced around briefly, taking in the trees, the house set back from the road, the absence of witnesses. Then his eyes landed on me. "Afternoon," he said, voice even, professional. "Got a minute?" I nodded once. "What's this about?" "Just responding to a call," he replied, already walking closer. "A call, of course." "From who?" I asked. He smiled slightly, the way officers do when they're about to say something intentionally vague. "Concerned party." That phrase landed exactly how it was meant to. It implied legitimacy without offering accountability. It also conveniently avoided answering the question. I looked back at the cruiser. The engine was still running. You're on private property, I said, keeping my tone level. This is a civil matter. He didn't disagree. That was the interesting part. I'm just here to make sure there's no issue, he said. Sometimes things escalate unnecessarily. The implication hung between us, unspoken but heavy. This could escalate if you make it. I felt anger rise then, sharp and immediate, but I pushed it down just as fast. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. This was the moment for discipline. Is there an allegation? I asked. Nothing formal, he said. Just wanted to check. Check what? He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the house, the fence line, the trees Karen had apparently found so offensive. He wasn't observing for safety. He was surveying, and he was doing it under color of authority. I thought about the violation notice, the lack of proof, the timing. This was escalation, plain and simple, paper pressure followed by physical presence, a message delivered without a single word that could later be quoted. PV person had merged into PV society, backed by a badge. I made myself breathe slowly. I'm happy to address any legitimate complaint, I said, but unless there's probable cause, I don't consent to searches or inspections. He looked back at me then, really looked, as if recalibrating. I'm not searching, he said, just talking. On my property, I replied. Another pause, another calculation. He shifted his stance slightly, angling his body so the cruiser was still visible behind him. It wasn't aggressive, it was symbolic. The presence mattered more than the action. You live pretty far out, he said. Response times can be slow. There it was, not a threat, not explicitly, just context. I nodded. That's why I chose it. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Irritation, maybe, or disappointment. He'd expected nerves, deference, something he could leverage. Instead, he got calm. All right, he said after a moment. I'll note that I made contact. Please do, I said, and please note that you entered private property without cause. His jaw tightened slightly. You don't have to make this difficult. I'm not, I replied. I'm making it accurate. That seemed to end it. He turned back toward the cruiser, walking unhurriedly, like the encounter had gone exactly as planned. Gravel shifted under his boots, the door opened, the engine revved. Before pulling away, he paused and leaned out the window. You might want to be more cooperative with the HOA, he said. It'll make things easier. Then he drove off. I stood there long after the sound faded, my heart beating louder than it had any right to. Not from fear, but from adrenaline restrained, the kind that leaves you shaky because you refuse to let it out. The silence that followed was heavier than before. This wasn't Karen sending letters anymore. This was Karen sending muscle. I walked the exact path the cruiser had taken, measuring it with my eyes, my steps, my memory. I knew where my property line was. I'd walked it 100 times. The cruiser had crossed it by at least 30 feet, 30 feet too far. Inside the house, I didn't sit down right away. I moved with purpose, not frantic, but deliberate. I pulled up my security system on the monitor and rewound the footage. There it was, the cruiser entering frame, timestamp clear, GPS overlay active, the pause, the angle, the position relative to the boundary markers. Clean. I exported the clip, labeled it carefully, and saved it in a new folder. Incident log. Then I wrote date, time, weather conditions, exact phrasing, badge number. I'd memorized it without realizing. I didn't editorialize. I didn't describe how it felt. I documented what happened, because feelings don't hold up. Facts do. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every passing car sounded louder. Every shadow felt closer. PV self crept in, not fear of him, but the awareness that systems designed to protect can be bent quietly, especially when no one thinks to watch. I thought about neighbors who wouldn't know the difference, who would see a cruiser and assume legitimacy, who would comply out of instinct. Karen knew that too. By morning, the anger had settled into something steadier. Resolve. I reviewed public records laws over coffee, learned how to request dispatch logs, learned how long footage needed to be retained, learned what internal affairs actually investigated and what they didn't. This wasn't retaliation territory yet, but it was documentation territory, and Karen had just made my case stronger without realizing it. The violation notice had been a bluff. This had been a gamble. and gambles leave trails. I stepped outside as the sun rose, light cutting through the trees the HOA found so offensive. The land was quiet again, peaceful, but it wasn't naive anymore. Karen had crossed from pressure to presence, from implication to action. And by doing that, she'd forced me into a role I hadn't wanted, but was fully prepared to play. Because once authority rolls onto private land without cause, it stops being an HOA issue. It becomes evidence. The day after the cruiser came onto my property, I didn't call anyone. That restraint surprised even me. There was a version of myself, louder, younger, that would have picked up the phone immediately, demanded a supervisor, filed a complaint fueled by adrenaline and righteous anger. That version would have felt good for about 10 minutes, and then spent months trying to explain why emotion had replaced precision. I didn't need to be loud. I needed to be right. Morning light moved slowly through the trees as I walked the perimeter again, retracing the path the cruiser had taken. The ground still bore shallow impressions where tires had compressed the gravel. I knelt, touched the edge of one, and let the moment settle. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was about record. Inside, I pulled up the camera system and reviewed everything a second time. Not just the clip of the cruiser, but the hours before and after. I checked timestamps, synced them against my phone clock, verified the GPS overlay. Accuracy matters when you're dealing with people who live inside technicalities. I didn't label the file emotionally. No harassment, no abuse, just facts. 2024, 05, 17, 14, 32 cruiser entry. East Drive, MP4, clean, neutral, unarguable. Then I backed it up twice. One copy local, one encrypted off-site. Evidence I'd learned only matters if it survives panic, yours or theirs. The next step wasn't confrontation, it was infrastructure. I adjusted camera angles slightly, not to spy, but to ensure coverage aligned with my boundaries. I reviewed blind spots and noted them. I confirmed retention settings and extended them. Not forever, just long enough. I wasn't escalating, I was preparing. Emails came next. I went back through every message Karen had ever sent me, not skimming, reading, tone, word choice, assumptions, the way she referenced oversight without citing authority, the way she framed compliance as inevitability instead of agreement. I saved them all as PDFs, dates intact, metadata preserved. I noticed patterns I hadn't before. How often she used we when decisions hadn't been voted on. How frequently she implied board consensus without naming anyone else. How carefully she avoided putting certain things in writing. People who intend to overreach often know exactly where the line is. They just hope you don't. I opened my notebook and started a clean timeline, not a diary, a log. First letter, neutral presence. Second letter, boundary language introduced. Third letter, physical placement escalation. In-person visit. Map, contradiction. Husband mentioned. Implied authority. Violation notice. Procedural failure. Cruiser entry. Jurisdiction breach. Seeing it laid out that way did something important. It removed doubt. PV self had been whispering questions since the first letter. Am I overreacting? Am I misreading this? Doubt thrives in isolation. Patterns kill it. This wasn't coincidence. It was progression. The following afternoon, I filed my first public records request. I kept it narrow, specific, professional. I requested dispatch logs for the time window corresponding to the cruiser's visit to my property. No commentary, no accusation, just dates, times, and call classification. I knew how these systems worked. Every call leaves a footprint, even just checking in, especially those. While I waited, I continued living normally, or at least appearing to. I mowed where mowing was permitted, walked the same paths, waved to the same neighbors when I saw them. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. That was intentional. PV society has a way of turning facts into rumors before truth ever gets a chance to settle. I didn't need allies yet. I needed accuracy. Karen, for her part, went quiet. No emails, no letters, no follow-ups. Silence can mean many things. In her case, I suspected recalibration. She'd applied pressure. She'd tested presence. Now she was waiting to see what moved. Nothing did. A week passed, then another. The records request came back on a Tuesday morning. I opened the email slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I understood what it represented. This was the first moment where narrative met system, The log was short. One call, non-emergency. Logged as a property concern. No citation issued, no follow-up required. Officer name listed. Badge number matched my memory. Location, approximate. Approximate was generous. The coordinates placed the cruiser inside my boundary. I exhaled for the first time that day. This was no longer my word against theirs. This was paper. I printed the log and placed it in the folder behind the camera stills and the emails. Each piece alone was inconclusive. Together, they told a story Karen hadn't anticipated. Authority used where it didn't belong. Quietly, casually, confidently. I didn't send the log to anyone. Not yet. Evidence isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It waits until the moment when denial costs more than admission. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes. A car slowed near the road one afternoon, but didn't stop. Another time, someone turned around earlier than usual. Whether coincidence or curiosity, I didn't know. I logged what I could verify and ignored what I couldn't. Karen eventually emailed again. The message was short, vague, almost friendly. Just checking in to see if you've had a chance to address the previous notice. No mention of the cruiser, no mention of specifics. Just pressure reintroduced softly, like she hoped time had blurred the edges. I replied once. Please provide the requested documentation related to the notice. Thank you. Nothing more. Her response never came. That told me more than any argument would have. People who have evidence respond with evidence. People who don't respond with delay. At night, when the wind moved through the trees, I found myself listening differently, not anxiously, but attentively. I was aware now of how easily peace could be mistaken for permission. PV nature had always been my ally out here. Distance, quiet, the absence of witnesses. Now I understood it could also be a vulnerability if I didn't compensate with structure. So I did. I labeled files, I mirrored drives, I wrote logs as if someone else would read them someday, because someone might. The discipline was exhausting in a way I hadn't expected. Not physically, mentally, it takes energy to stay calm when provoked, to wait when you could act, to trust that patience would pay off. There were moments, late, when the house creaked and the world felt too still, where I questioned whether this was worth it, whether quiet land and clean lines justified the intrusion. PVA self again. But each time doubt crept in, I returned to the facts, to the footage, to the log, to the undeniable reality that none of this had been initiated by me. I hadn't escalated. I'd been targeted. That distinction mattered. By the third time the cruiser showed up, it stopped feeling like an anomaly. That was the moment Karen lost control of the narrative, without realizing it. The first visit had rattled me. The second had angered me. The third one did something different. It clarified everything. I was on the backside of the property that afternoon, near the tree break where the land dips and the sound of the road barely carries. The day was hot, air thick and unmoving, the kind that makes even small noises feel amplified. When I heard the engine this time, there was no spike of adrenaline, just recognition. I didn't rush, I didn't hide. I walked toward the driveway at a normal pace, already checking the time in my head, already thinking about angles and sightlines. The cruiser pulled in exactly the same way as before, same path, same confident roll past the boundary marker, same casual disregard for where public access ended and private land began. It stopped closer this time, closer than before. He stepped out again, Karen's husband, posture relaxed, hand near his belt like it belonged there permanently. The familiarity was unmistakable. This wasn't an officer responding to a call, this was someone exercising comfort. "Afternoon," he said again, like we were neighbors. I nodded once. "What's the concern today?" He glanced around, eyes lingering on the house, the trees, the fence line. "We got another call." "Same caller?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "You've been uncooperative with the HOA." That was new. That wasn't observation. That was judgment. "This isn't an HOA matter," I said, "and you know that." He shrugged slightly. Sometimes things overlap. I felt something shift then, not in him, but in me. The hesitation I'd been managing since Chapter 3 finally burned off. What remained was focus. "You're standing on private property again," I said calmly. "Is there probable cause?" His jaw tightened just a fraction. "I'm here to keep the peace." "No," I said evenly. You're here because your wife doesn't like my answers. The air changed instantly. His eyes hardened. Not explosive, controlled. That was worse. You need to be careful how you talk, he said. There it was, the first direct edge, the line Karen had been skirting for weeks. I am being careful, I replied. That's why I'm asking you to leave. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves overhead, filling the silence with something organic, something indifferent to both of us. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and took a step back. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said. I'm not, I answered. You are. He turned and walked back to the cruiser without another word. This time, he didn't linger, didn't offer advice, didn't lean out the window before leaving. He drove off fast enough to kick up dust. I stood there alone, listening to the sound fade, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into place. This hadn't been about checking in. This hadn't been about safety. This had been pressure. And pressure leaves marks. Inside, I pulled up the camera footage again. Same routine, same precision. Except now, there was something different. Context. 3 visits, 3 logs, 3 dispatch entries. Pattern. I opened my notebook and added a new heading. Repeated use of authority for civil pressure. That phrase wasn't emotional. It was accurate. Later that evening, one of my neighbors stopped by. We weren't close. Friendly waves, occasional small talk, but not the kind of relationship that involved visits. That alone told me something had shifted. Hey, he said, standing near the fence. Everything all right over here? I didn't rush to answer. I didn't deny anything either. What makes you ask? I said. He nodded toward the road. Seen a police car come through a few times. There it was. The thing Karen hadn't accounted for. Visibility. I've noticed, I said. He hesitated, then added, just seemed unusual. I agree, I replied. I didn't explain. I didn't vent. I didn't recruit. I just let the observation exist between us. He nodded slowly. Well, if you need anything. After he left, I stood by the fence for a long time, watching the road. Karen's strategy had relied on isolation, on the assumption that no one would question a badge, especially not on a quiet road where nothing ever happened. But repetition attracts attention. PV society doesn't activate through outrage. It activates through curiosity. The next HOA email arrived the following morning. Short, curt, procedural. It referenced ongoing concerns and warned of potential next steps if compliance wasn't achieved. No specifics, no deadlines. Just escalation language designed to sound inevitable. Karen's tone was different now, less confident, sharper, like someone pressing harder because the leverage they expected wasn't working. I didn't respond. That was intentional. I'd reached a point where replies would only feed the illusion of debate. Karen wanted engagement on her terms. She wanted to keep this framed as an HOA issue. It wasn't, not anymore. Over the next week, the cruiser appeared twice more. Once it slowed, but didn't stop. The second time, it pulled halfway in, then reversed out. Both instances were caught on camera. Both were logged. By then, I'd stopped feeling anger altogether. What I felt instead was certainty, the kind that comes when a situation crosses a threshold and can't return to ambiguity. Karen had overplayed the badge. She'd taken something meant for public safety and turned it into a private enforcement tool, not loudly, not recklessly, but repeatedly. And repetition is the one thing systems can't ignore. I filed a second public records request, this one broader, still narrow enough to be reasonable, but wide enough to show frequency. I didn't rush it, I didn't announce it. I let the system move at its pace. PV self still whispered sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet, and the responsibility of what I was building felt heavy. There's a cost to holding someone accountable, especially when they don't realize you've started. But each time doubt surfaced, I reminded myself of one thing. I didn't create this situation. I responded to it. Karen's mistake wasn't that she pushed. It was that she pushed using someone else's authority and assumed no one would notice. By the end of the month, the HOA emails stopped completely. No reminders, no threats, no updates. That silence wasn't peace. It was containment. Something had shifted behind the scenes. I didn't know exactly what yet, but I could feel it. The way pressure evaporates suddenly when someone realizes the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. Karen had believed the badge would scare me into compliance. Instead, she'd turned a private dispute into a public accountability issue. And the moment she did that, the outcome stopped being about her. It became about the system. And systems don't respond to confidence. They respond to evidence. The meeting notice didn't look urgent. That should have been my first clue. HOA emails usually followed a predictable rhythm, agenda attached, dates bolded, language padded with politeness. This one was shorter, cleaner, almost sterile. A special session, it said, scheduled midweek instead of the usual weekend slot. No detailed agenda, just attendance encouraged. I read it twice, then once more an hour later, not because I missed anything, but because I understood what it meant. Special sessions weren't for routine matters. They were for control, either reasserting it or containing damage before it spread. By then, the cruiser sightings had become neighborhood knowledge, not gossip yet, but awareness. The kind that moves quietly from porch to porch, phrased as questions instead of accusations. You seen that car out by his place again? That normal? Karen had wanted pressure applied in isolation. She'd gotten visibility instead. The night of the meeting, the weather was wrong for summer. Thick clouds sat low and unmoving, trapping heat and sound. Even the drive into the community felt heavier than usual. Headlights stretching across asphalt that suddenly seemed too narrow. The parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. That alone changed the math. People stood in small clusters near the entrance, conversations hushed, heads tilting when they noticed me. Not hostile, curious, assessing. I felt it in my chest, not anxiety, but the familiar tension that comes when perf society wakes up and starts paying attention. Inside, the room buzzed softly, chairs scraped, papers shuffled. Someone laughed too loudly, then stopped. The board sat at the front table, 5 members arranged neatly, laptops open, water bottles lined up like props. Karen sat in the center. She looked composed, perfectly so. Hair neat, posture upright. But I noticed the way her fingers tapped the table before the meeting started, not rhythmically, impatiently. She didn't look at me when I took a seat near the middle. That was deliberate. Karen preferred to control the room before acknowledging variables she couldn't predict. When the meeting was called to order, she wasted no time. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she began, voice smooth and projected. "We felt it was important to address some ongoing compliance matters and clarify expectations." Compliance. There it was again. She spoke in generalities, referencing outlying properties, inconsistent adherence, and the importance of uniform standards. She never said my name. She didn't need to. The narrative was already framed. I listened carefully, not just to what she said, but to what she avoided. No mention of specific violations, no acknowledgement of enforcement procedures, and certainly no reference to police involvement. That omission was intentional. Karen was trying to reset the story, to pull it back into HOA territory, where she still believed she had the advantage. When she finished, she asked if there were questions. Silence followed, heavy, expectant. I didn't raise my hand immediately. I let the pause stretch just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Then I stood. "I have a question," I said. Karen's eyes flicked to me for the first time, just a glance. Calculating. "Yes?" she replied. I kept my voice calm, neutral, not loud enough to provoke, not soft enough to disappear. "You mentioned compliance issues," I said. "Could you clarify which specific guideline applies to properties outside the visual corridor and how violations are documented?" That was it. No accusation, no story. Just procedure. Karen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Each case is reviewed individually," she said. "The board has discretion to interpret guidelines as needed." "Understood," I replied. "Then could you explain why violation notices have been issued without dates, locations, or supporting documentation?" A murmur rippled through the room. Karen straightened. "We follow established processes." "Could you outline them?" I asked. "For transparency." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another glanced down at his laptop. Karen hesitated, just a beat too long. "Our enforcement committee." "Is that a standing committee?" I interrupted gently. "I don't see it listed in the bylaws." Now heads were turning. This wasn't confrontation. It was illumination. Karen's tone sharpened slightly. "We're not here to debate technicalities." "I'm not debating," I said. "I'm asking how decisions are made." The difference mattered. Someone in the back raised their hand. "I'd like to know that too." Another voice followed. "Same here." Karen looked briefly to her left, then right, as if expecting backup. It didn't come. The board members sat stiffly, suddenly very interested in their screens. "Let's stay focused," Karen said. "These matters are handled appropriately." "That may be," I replied. "But when authority is exercised without clarity, it creates confusion." Confusion, not abuse, not misconduct. Language matters. Karen leaned forward. "Are you suggesting impropriety?" I met her gaze. "I'm suggesting documentation." The room went quiet again, this time not expectant but alert. One of the older homeowners spoke up. "I received a notice last year that didn't list a date either." Another added, "Mine didn't include a photo." Karen's fingers stopped tapping. "This meeting isn't about individual grievances," she said tightly. "No," I agreed. "It's about process." That was the moment the tone shifted completely. Karen had built her authority on the assumption that people wouldn't compare notes, that compliance happened in isolation, that no one would ask how decisions traveled from observation to enforcement. But now they were. I didn't speak again after that. I didn't need to. The room had found its voice, and it didn't belong to me. Questions came faster, calm, reasonable ones. How are violations verified? Who authorizes enforcement actions? What's the appeal process? Karen answered where she could, deflected where she couldn't. And each deflection widened the gap between her confidence and the room's trust. Near the end of the meeting, one board member cleared his throat. "We may need to review some of these procedures," he said carefully. Karen's head snapped toward him. "That's not necessary." He didn't look at her. "I think it is." That was it. Not dramatic, not loud, but definitive. The meeting adjourned shortly after. No resolutions passed, no votes taken. Just a vague promise to follow up. People stood slowly, conversations restarting in low tones. I felt eyes on me. Not accusatory, not grateful, curious, reevaluating. As I gathered my things, two homeowners approached quietly. "We've had similar issues," one said. "Didn't know how to question it." Another nodded. "You handled that well." I thanked them, but I didn't linger. This wasn't the moment for alliances. It was the moment for restraint. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, lighter somehow. The clouds had shifted just enough to let moonlight through. I took a deep breath and realized something important. Karen hadn't lost control because I challenged her. She'd lost it because the room started listening. PV society doesn't need a leader. It just needs clarity. I drove home slowly, windows down, the sound of tires on asphalt steady and grounding. Back on my road, the trees closed in again, familiar and indifferent. The land didn't care about meetings or politics or power plays. It just waited. And for the first time since Karen's name had appeared on that first letter, I felt the balance tip. Not in my favor exactly, but away from her. The badge had drawn attention. The meeting had confirmed patterns. Whatever came next wouldn't be quiet, but it would be undeniable. I didn't file the complaint the night after the meeting. That surprised me. The adrenaline was there, the kind that comes when you realize a room shifted because you asked the right questions at the right time. It would have been easy to ride that momentum straight into action, to strike while Karen was visibly off balance, to capitalize on the uncertainty she'd failed to contain. But timing matters more than speed. And I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in closing a door behind her that couldn't be reopened, so I waited. The days after the meeting were quieter than they had any right to be. No HOA emails, no follow-ups, no clarifications. It was as if the system had gone into a holding pattern, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Karen, for the first time since this started, went silent. That silence wasn't peace, it was assessment. I went back to my routine, work, maintenance, long walks along the tree line, where the land dipped and the air stayed cool. PV, nature had always steadied me, and now it did again, reminding me that time doesn't rush for anyone. At night, I reviewed my files, not anxiously, methodically, footage clips arranged by date, dispatch logs aligned with timestamps. HOA emails converted to PDFs with headers intact, meeting minutes downloaded and archived. I created a clean index, not for me, but for someone else. Someone who wouldn't care about how this felt. Someone who would only care about what could be proven. That's when the idea fully settled. Internal affairs. Not as revenge, not as escalation, as procedure. There's a misconception people have about internal affairs, that it's a weapon or a threat, or a nuclear option you deploy when you want to hurt someone. Karen almost certainly shared that belief. It's why she'd been so casual about borrowing her husband's badge. She assumed any complaint would be emotional, exaggerated, easily dismissed as a disgruntled homeowner pushing back against authority. She was wrong. Internal affairs doesn't care about HOA disputes. It doesn't care about personalities. It doesn't care about who started what. It cares about one thing, whether authority was used appropriately. And authority leaves records. I drafted the complaint on a Wednesday morning, coffee cooling beside me, the house still quiet. I didn't rush it. I didn't write it like a story. I wrote it like a timeline. On date, a uniformed officer entered my private property without probable cause. The visit was logged as a non-emergency property concern. No citation was issued, no safety issue was identified. The officer is the spouse of the HOA president, who had recently issued a procedurally incomplete violation notice. That was it. No adjectives, no assumptions, no speculation about intent. I didn't accuse him of harassment or intimidation. I didn't claim malice. I let the facts sit where they belonged. Then I attached the evidence. Video clip, dispatch log, property survey showing boundaries, HOA correspondence establishing context. I didn't explain the evidence, I didn't highlight it, I simply labeled each attachment clearly and accurately. I read the complaint twice before submitting it, not to soften it, but to ensure it didn't try to do more than it needed to. Overreaching in a complaint undermines its own credibility. When I finally hit submit, there was no rush of relief, no sense of triumph, just quiet certainty. Karen didn't know it yet, but the story had left her hands. The confirmation email arrived an hour later, automated, impersonal, exactly what I wanted. A case number, no promises, no timelines, just acknowledgement. That's how systems speak when they're about to move. I didn't tell anyone, not the neighbors who would approach me after the meeting, not the board members who'd suddenly become more cautious in their language, not even myself, really. I compartmentalized it the way you do, when you know something is in motion but hasn't reached the surface yet. PV self tried to intrude that night. What if nothing comes of it? What if this makes things worse? What if you're wrong? Those questions didn't come from fear of Karen. They came from the weight of escalation. Once you involve a system designed to audit authority, you accept that outcomes aren't yours to control. But control was never the goal. Accuracy was. The following week passed slowly. Karen resurfaced, sort of. An HOA email went out to the entire community, framed as a procedural update. It mentioned reviewing enforcement practices, ensuring consistency, and reaffirming commitment to transparency. Karen's name was still on it, but the tone had changed. No confidence, no authority language, just careful phrasing and distance from specifics. It read like something written with oversight in mind, like someone suddenly aware that words could be examined later. I noticed something else too. The cruiser stopped appearing, not gradually, not sporadically, completely. At first, I thought I might be imagining the absence, the way you sometimes do when tension drops and your body hasn't caught up yet. But days passed, then more. No tires on gravel, no slow rolls past the tree line, no idling engine. The road belonged to itself again. That was when I knew the complaint had landed. Internal affairs doesn't announce investigations. It doesn't warn subjects. It doesn't posture. It simply removes variables while it evaluates them. Officers under review don't get to keep showing up in situations that might complicate a file. Karen, of course, didn't know that. From her perspective, things probably felt stable again. The meeting had passed. The emails had cooled. The badge was temporarily out of sight. She likely assumed the pressure had worked, or at least that it hadn't backfired. That assumption would cost her. I received a call late one afternoon from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, the message was brief and professional. This is Investigator Domshishbaaz with Internal Affairs. Please call me back at your convenience. No urgency, no drama, just process. When we spoke the next day, the tone was exactly what I'd expected. Neutral, focused, no opinions offered. He asked me to confirm dates, to verify that the footage hadn't been altered, to clarify whether I'd had any prior disputes with the officer unrelated to the HOA. I answered honestly, concisely. At no point did he ask me how I felt. That told me everything. Before the call ended, he said something that stuck with me. "We don't determine intent," he said. "We determine appropriateness." Karen had built her entire strategy around intent. Friendly check-ins, casual mentions, plausible deniability. Appropriateness doesn't care about any of that. It cares about context. After that call, I went for a long walk. The sky was clear, the air cooler than it had been in weeks. I followed the same path I always did, past the fence line, down toward the dip where the trees grew thickest. I thought about how many times people mistake silence for weakness, how often systems get abused not because they're malicious, but because no one expects to be audited. Karen had expected compliance. She hadn't expected scrutiny. That evening, another HOA email arrived. This one announced Karen would be temporarily delegating certain responsibilities to another board member. No explanation, no timeline, just a shift. Subtle, strategic, too late. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. What I felt was something closer to gravity, inevitable, steady, impersonal. Internal affairs wasn't what Karen thought it was. It wasn't a threat she could intimidate her way around. It wasn't a complaint she could reframe. It wasn't a person she could talk to. It was a process. And processes don't respond to confidence or familiarity. They respond to records. By the end of the month, the house was quiet again, in the way it had been before all of this started. Not tense quiet, not watchful quiet, just quiet. But I knew better now than to confuse quiet with innocence. Somewhere, files were being reviewed, logs compared, questions asked that didn't include Karen in the room. And for the first time since her name had appeared on that first letter, she wasn't in control of the pace anymore. I didn't know how it would end. But I knew this. Whatever happened next wouldn't be decided by who spoke the loudest, or who held the most confidence, or who had access to a badge. It would be decided by what had been written down. And I had written everything. I noticed the absence before I understood it. That's how patterns work. You don't mark the day they end. You feel the space they leave behind. For weeks, the sound of engines on gravel had trained my body to react. Even when I told myself I was calm, my senses stayed half alert, listening for tires where tires didn't belong. A car slowing, a pause too long near the tree line, the subtle disruption of quiet that never quite returned to normal afterward. Then one morning passed without it. I was on the porch just after sunrise, coffee cooling in my hands, watching mist lift off the low ground near the fence. The road stayed empty. No slow roll, no hesitation. No black and white shape pressing its way into a place it had no reason to be. I didn't celebrate. I waited. The second day passed the same way, then the third. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. The cruiser wasn't coming back. That realization didn't land with relief the way I expected. It landed with caution. Because pressure doesn't disappear. It relocates. When authority withdraws suddenly, it's almost never voluntary. It's procedural. The house felt different without the tension humming just under the surface. Not lighter exactly, but steadier. Like a muscle that had been clenched for too long finally let go, leaving behind soreness instead of pain. I found myself sleeping deeper, not better, deeper. The kind of sleep where you don't dream because your brain isn't running contingency plans all night. Still, every morning I check the cameras, not obsessively, habitually. No cruiser, no slow passes, no half turns at the edge of the drive, nothing. Karen's emails changed too. The first sign wasn't silence, it was caution. Where her messages had once been confident, declarative, full of implied authority, they now read like drafts reviewed by someone else. Language softened. Phrases like under review and pending clarification replaced must comply and expected action. She stopped referencing deadlines altogether. That shift mattered more than the absence of the badge. People who believe they're in control don't hedge their words. I received one message midweek that stood out. We are currently reassessing certain enforcement practices to ensure alignment with all applicable standards. No signature line, no name, just the HOA. Karen was stepping back without saying she was stepping back. The road remained quiet. Neighbors passed as they always had. But now there was something different in their expressions. Not concern, not suspicion. Awareness, a sense that something had happened, even if they couldn't quite name it. PV society doesn't demand explanations. It senses imbalance. One afternoon, I ran into the same neighbor who'd stopped by weeks earlier. "Things settle down?" he asked casually. "For now," I replied. He nodded, satisfied, like that was all he needed. People don't want details. They want confirmation that the world still makes sense. I didn't correct him. Inside, I stayed disciplined. Just because pressure lifted didn't mean the process was over. In fact, that's often when people make mistakes, assuming absence means resolution. I continued logging, continued archiving, continued documenting what didn't happen, which in some cases matters just as much as what does. No police presence after date, no HOA enforcement actions issued, no follow-up communication regarding alleged violations. Absence is data when it breaks a pattern. A week later, I received an email from the internal affairs investigator. Short, direct. They needed to schedule a formal interview. That explained everything. Officers under activist review don't keep showing up in situations tied to the complaint. Departments remove variables first, then ask questions. It's not punitive, it's protective. For the system, not the individual. Karen's husband wasn't staying away because he chose to. He was staying away because someone else had decided he should. The interview date was set for the following Tuesday. I didn't tell anyone, not the neighbors, not the HOA. Not even myself, fully. I treated it like any other appointment, something on the calendar that required preparation, not emotion. In the days leading up to it, I reviewed my files again, not to add anything, but to subtract anything unnecessary, anything speculative, anything that didn't belong. I wasn't building a case, I was presenting a record. Karen reappeared briefly during that time, though not directly. A notice went out announcing a temporary adjustment in leadership duties. No explanation, no mention of her name stepping back, just a redistribution of responsibilities to another board member. Karen's name was still listed as president, but power doesn't reside in titles. It resides in who's allowed to act, and Karen wasn't acting anymore. PV self-stirred again that night. There's a strange discomfort that comes with success when you weren't aiming for it. I hadn't wanted this to escalate into something formal. I hadn't wanted anyone to lose anything. All I'd wanted was to be left alone on land I legally owned. Now the machinery was moving, and I wasn't the one turning the gears. I reminded myself of something important. I hadn't reported a person. I'd reported behavior. What happened next was about accountability, not intention. The night before the interview, the wind moved hard through the trees, bending branches into restless shapes against the sky. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, listening to the house settle, thinking about how easily power gets misused when no one expects it to be examined. Karen had assumed silence meant safety. She'd assumed familiarity meant immunity. She'd assumed the badge could be used casually, like a favor, like an extension of HOA authority instead of something bound by rules far stricter than hers. And now, the badge was gone from my road. The interview itself was scheduled for mid-morning. Neutral location, no uniforms, no drama. Before leaving, I checked the cameras one last time. The road was empty. As I pulled out of the drive, I realized something else had changed. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't scanning for movement behind me. I wasn't calculating angles or rehearsing responses. The vigilance that had become second nature had loosened its grip. Not because the situation was over, but because it had moved beyond me. When I returned later that afternoon, the house greeted me the way it always had, quiet, patient, unchanged. PV nature doesn't respond to human conflict, it endures it. I walked the property once more as the sun dipped low, light filtering through the trees in long, slanted lines. The fence stood where it always had. The land remained what it had always been. Mine. The absence of the cruiser no longer felt temporary. It felt structural. Karen had pushed until the system noticed. Now the system was responding, and for the first time since her name had appeared on that first letter, she was no longer the one deciding what happened next. The badge hadn't returned, and it wasn't going to. The building didn't look like anything important. That was the first thing I noticed. No signage out front announcing authority. No flags. No uniformed presence pacing the entrance. Just a low concrete structure set back from the road, clean but forgettable. Like it didn't want to be associated with drama, or remembered at all. That suited me. I parked, sat for a moment, and let my breathing settle. Not because I was nervous, but because I understood the weight of what this room represented. Once you step into a process like this, the story stops being yours to steer. Accuracy replaces intention. Record replaces reputation. Inside, the air was cool and dry, the kind that makes every sound feel slightly sharper. A receptionist asked my name, checked it against a list, and nodded without expression. "Have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." The chair was hard. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it needed to. I didn't check my phone. I didn't review notes. I'd already done the work. Anything I tried to rehearse now would only dilute it. When the investigator opened the door, he didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He simply said my name and gestured for me to follow. The room we entered was small and plain. Table, 2 chairs, a recorder placed neatly between them. No badge, no uniform, no attempt at intimidation or comfort. Neutral ground. "Before we begin," he said, sitting down across from me, "I need to let you know this interview is being recorded. You're not under investigation. You're a reporting party. You're free to stop at any time." I nodded. "Understood." He clicked the recorder on. The first questions were simple: identification, address, confirmation that I'd submitted the complaint. He moved carefully, methodically, like someone assembling a structure one bolt at a time. Then we reached the substance. "Can you describe the first interaction you had with the officer?" I didn't rush. I gave dates, locations, what was said and what wasn't. I avoided adjectives, avoided interpretation. I didn't say intimidating. I said entered private property without probable cause. I didn't say threatened. I said referenced HOA compliance during a police contact. Words matter in rooms like this. He asked follow-ups when necessary, clarifications, distances, whether signage was visible, whether I'd consented to his presence. I answered everything calmly. At one point, he paused and looked up from his notes. "You've been very precise," he said. "I've had time," I replied. He nodded once and continued. When we reached the footage, he didn't react. He watched it without commentary, rewinding certain sections, checking timestamps against the log in front of him. He didn't ask me how it made me feel. He didn't ask what I thought the officer intended. He didn't need to. Context was doing the work for me. "What's your relationship with the HOA president?" he asked. "None," I said, "other than correspondence." "Any prior disputes with her husband?" "No." "Any criminal history?" "No." The questions weren't accusatory. They were eliminative, designed to remove alternative explanations until only one remained. At one point, he asked something I hadn't anticipated. "Why didn't you file the complaint sooner?" I considered that for a moment before answering. "Because I wanted to be sure it wasn't a misunderstanding," I said. "Patterns matter more than incidents." That answer seemed to satisfy him. He leaned back slightly, folded his hands, and studied me, not skeptically, but thoughtfully. "Do you know how often we get complaints like this?" he asked. "I can imagine," I said. "Most of them are emotional," he continued, "or vague, or retaliatory." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. "Yours wasn't," he said. That wasn't praise. It was observation. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but the tone had shifted, less probing, more confirmation. He asked if there was anything else I wanted to add. I shook my head. "I've provided everything I have." "That's sufficient," he said. When he turned the recorder off, the room felt different, not lighter, resolved, like a door had been closed somewhere out of sight. "Next steps?" I asked. He was careful with his response. "There will be follow-up," he said. "You may not be informed of outcomes directly." "I understand." He stood, signaling the end. As I left the building, sunlight hit harder than I expected, making me squint for a second. The world outside felt louder, less controlled. Cars passed. Someone laughed in the distance. Life continuing uninterrupted by the process I'd just stepped into. On the drive home, I didn't replay the interview. That surprised me too. There was nothing to analyze, no mistakes I could fix, No answers I wished I'd phrased differently. The truth had been simple, and simplicity holds up well under scrutiny. When I turned onto my road, the trees closed in like they always did. The property came into view slowly, revealing itself in layers the way it always had. Nothing looked different, but everything felt settled, not finished, settled. The next few days were uneventful in the best possible way. No HOA emails, no surprise notices, no vehicles slowing near the tree line. The road remained empty, untouched by authority or assumption. Karen didn't reach out, not once. I imagined her confidence fracturing quietly, the way it does when someone realizes control has slipped without a clear moment to point to. No confrontation, no accusation, just absence. PV's self tried to creep back in once or twice. What if this isn't enough? What if nothing happens? But those thoughts didn't stick. They couldn't. Because the process had already reached a point where outcome was no longer dependent on me. I'd done my part. A week later, a thin envelope arrived from the HOA. Not a violation, not a warning, a notice. It announced that upcoming meetings would be chaired by the vice president until further notice. Karen's name appeared only once, buried in the middle, referenced as currently unavailable. No explanation, no farewell. That was when I knew. Not because I wanted consequences, but because systems don't move leadership around without reason. They don't shift power quietly unless something louder is happening behind the scenes. The badge still didn't return. Days passed, then more. The absence hardened into certainty. I walked the property one evening as the sun dropped low, light catching on leaves and fence posts in familiar ways. PV nature remained unchanged, steady, indifferent to human miscalculations. As I reached the far boundary, I stopped and looked back toward the house, toward the road, toward the quiet stretch where authority had once rolled in, uninvited. I felt something then, not triumph, closure. The interview they hadn't prepared for wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. It didn't expose anyone publicly or resolve anything instantly. But it did something far more permanent. It transferred the narrative from assumption to record, from confidence to consequence. Karen had believed the badge would protect her. She hadn't understood that badges answer to systems far less personal and far less forgiving than an HOA board. Whatever came next wouldn't involve me directly. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. The notice for the meeting arrived on a Friday afternoon. Not by email this time, by certified mail. That alone told me this wasn't routine. HOAs don't spend extra money unless they're trying to protect themselves from something. Certified notices mean records. They mean timelines. They mean someone, somewhere, has already advised caution. The letter was short, no agenda, no explanation. Just a date, a time, and the phrase special session of the board. I didn't feel nervous reading it. What I felt was distance, the kind that comes when something has moved far enough away from you that you can observe it instead of bracing for it. Whatever this meeting was about, it wasn't going to be decided by anything I said or did anymore. I decided to attend anyway. The parking lot was full again, more full than the last meeting. Cars lined the edges where people normally avoided parking. Groups stood near trunks and tailgates, voices low, conversations clipped and careful. This time, no one avoided looking at me. No one stared either. The attention had shifted from curiosity to awareness. Inside, the room felt different immediately. Not tense, restrained, like everyone had been told, implicitly or explicitly, to watch what they said. Board members sat closer together. Papers were neatly stacked, laptops closed. Karen wasn't at the center seat. That was the first public crack. She sat 2 chairs down, posture rigid, hands folded tightly in front of her. The confident ease she'd once carried like armor was gone. In its place was something brittle, control held together by effort instead of certainty. When the meeting was called to order, it wasn't Karen who spoke. The vice president did. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and read from a prepared statement. His voice was steady but careful, like someone walking across ice they had been warned not to test. This meeting has been convened to address recent concerns regarding governance practices and external inquiries, he said. External inquiries. No one missed that. Karen stared straight ahead, jaw tight. The vice president continued. We'll be limiting comments to procedural matters only. That, too, was telling. Karen didn't interrupt, didn't object, didn't attempt to reclaim control. That silence spoke louder than any outburst could have. As the statement ended, the room stayed quiet, not awkwardly, intentionally. People were listening differently now, measuring language, watching reactions. A homeowner raised her hand. Are these concerns related to enforcement actions? The vice president hesitated, just long enough. Yes, he said finally, in part. Another hand went up. And police involvement? That one landed hard. Karen shifted in her chair for the first time. The vice president didn't answer immediately. He glanced sideways, once toward Karen, then back to the room. There are matters under review, he said carefully. We're not at liberty to discuss details. That was when Karen broke. Speculation isn't helpful, she snapped, voice sharper than it needed to be. This board has always acted in good faith. The reaction was immediate, and not in her favor. People didn't argue. They didn't shout. They simply leaned back, folded arms, exchanged glances. Authority doesn't collapse when it's challenged. It collapses when it's no longer believed. The vice president raised a hand slightly. Karen, please. That was the second crack. Being corrected publicly, gently, but firmly, was something she wasn't used to. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped herself. Too late. The room had already shifted. Another board member spoke up. We've received guidance recommending that certain responsibilities be temporarily reassigned. Temporarily? Karen's head snapped toward him. That wasn't agreed. He cut her off. It was advised. That word mattered. Advised meant legal counsel. It meant outside eyes. It meant Karen's interpretation of authority was no longer the only one in the room. The vice president resumed control, voice firmer now. Effective immediately. Enforcement decisions will be handled by committee review only. Direct actions are suspended pending further assessment. Karen's hands clenched. Someone in the back asked the question no one had wanted to ask before. Is this about misuse of authority? The silence that followed was absolute. The vice president didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. We are cooperating fully with all inquiries, he said. Karen stared at the table. That was it. No denial, no defense, no confidence, just compliance. I didn't speak once during that meeting. I didn't need to. This wasn't about vindication. It wasn't even about me anymore. This was about a system publicly acknowledging that something had gone wrong, and that the person who'd driven it was no longer trusted to steer. When the meeting adjourned, people stood slowly, gathering belongings with the same care they'd shown their words. Conversations started, but quietly. Not gossip. Processing. Karen stood last. She didn't look at anyone as she walked out, didn't hold the door, didn't pause to explain or justify. The authority she'd once wielded like a tool had evaporated in plain view. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it should have. A breeze moved through the parking lot, lifting leaves and carrying voices just far enough that no one conversation could dominate. Two homeowners nodded at me as they passed. No smiles, no congratulations. Just acknowledgement. I drove home alone, headlights cutting through the dark road, trees closing in as they always had. When I turned onto my property, the quiet felt earned. Not stolen back, not borrowed. Earned. Karen's authority hadn't collapsed because I confronted her. It collapsed because it couldn't survive exposure. Because confidence without procedure doesn't hold up when people start asking how power is actually used. Because borrowed authority, especially borrowed from a badge, comes with a price no HOA can pay on your behalf. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the world settle back into itself. This wasn't the end, but it was the point of no return. Karen had lost control publicly, and whatever consequences followed would no longer be hidden behind emails, clipboards, or implied power. They would arrive the only way accountability ever does, quietly, officially, and without asking her permission. The confirmation didn't come with drama. No knock on the door, no official letter with bold language, no phone call that started with an apology or ended with a threat. It came the way real consequences usually do, quietly, through channels that don't care whether you're ready to hear them or not. I was in the middle of an ordinary morning when the email arrived. No subject line that hinted at significance, just a sender I recognized immediately. Internal affairs. The message itself was short, careful, and deliberately limited. The review has concluded. Appropriate administrative action has been taken. Thank you for your cooperation. That was it. No explanation, no outcome spelled out, no invitation to respond. I read it twice, then once more. Not because it was unclear, but because of what it didn't say. Internal Affairs doesn't issue verdicts for public consumption. It doesn't narrate consequences. It documents them, enacts them, and moves on. Whatever had happened, it had crossed the threshold from inquiry to resolution, and it hadn't required my opinion. Later that afternoon, I learned the rest the way most people do, indirectly. A neighbor stopped me while I was walking the fence line, leaning against his truck like he wasn't sure whether to bring it up. "Hey," he said, "you hear about Karen's husband?" I didn't answer right away. I let him finish. "They say he's no longer with the department," he added. "Administrative separation, I think." Administrative separation. People hear that phrase and imagine something sudden. A badge taken in a hallway. A tense conversation behind closed doors. A dramatic turning point. The truth is quieter. Badges aren't taken in moments. They're forfeited over time. Every unauthorized visit. Every vague justification. Every time authority is used where it doesn't belong. By the time paperwork catches up, the decision has already been made. "I hadn't heard," I said honestly. The neighbor nodded, eyes drifting toward the road. "Guess things got bigger than anyone expected." That was one way to put it. After he left, I stood there for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. PV nature didn't react. It never does. It doesn't care who holds power or loses it. It just keeps going. I thought about Karen then, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity. She hadn't lost because someone targeted her. She lost because she confused access with immunity. The badge hadn't protected her husband. It had exposed him. Over the next few days, pieces fell into place quietly. Karen resigned from the HOA. Not in a meeting, not in an announcement, just a short notice posted on the community board. Effective immediately, Karen will be stepping down from her position as HOA president. No thanks for service, no explanation, no farewell. Authority leaves the same way it arrives, without asking permission. The board appointed an interim president. Emails resumed, cautious and procedural. Enforcement actions were paused pending review. Language shifted from command to compliance. It was subtle, but it was complete. Karen didn't reach out to me, not once. No apology, no accusation, no attempt to reframe what had happened. That silence wasn't pride, it was understanding. She knew, now, that nothing she said would matter. That the story had left the realm of conversation and entered the realm of record. That confidence, once shattered publicly, doesn't rebuild easily, especially when systems have already decided. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was something closer to equilibrium. This hadn't been a win, it had been a correction. I walked the property that evening as the sun dropped low, light catching on fence posts and leaves the same way it always had. The land hadn't changed, the boundaries hadn't moved, only the pressure was gone. The badge had been the lever Karen relied on. The thing she believed would end the conversation before it began. She hadn't understood that law enforcement authority isn't transferable. It doesn't bend to personal convenience. And when it's misused, the system doesn't negotiate. It audits. I thought back to the first time Karen mentioned her husband casually, like his job was an accessory she could deploy, how confident she'd sounded, how sure she'd been that no one would question it. She hadn't anticipated patience. She hadn't anticipated documentation. And she certainly hadn't anticipated a process that didn't care who she was. By the time the badge was gone, it hadn't been taken from him. He'd already given it up, piece by piece. Every time he treated private land like public space, every time he let a civil dispute bleed into his professional authority. That's how forfeiture works. No one storms in to claim what's already been abandoned. That night, I sat on the porch longer than usual, listening to the world settle, no engines, no interruptions. Just the sound of insects and wind and distance doing what they do best. For the first time since this all began, there was nothing left to prepare for. No logs to update, no cameras to review, no responses to anticipate. The system had finished its work. Karen's authority was gone, her husband's badge was gone, and the quiet I'd come here for had finally returned without conditions. There was only one chapter left. Not about conflict, about what remains after it. The paperwork arrived before the peace did. That's how it usually works. Resolution comes in envelopes and attachments long before it settles into your body. The first letter was from the HOA's legal counsel, formal, neutral, scrubbed clean of personality. It confirmed what the board had already implied in fragments and silence. Enforcement practices had been reviewed, boundary interpretations clarified, and all actions related to my property were officially closed. No violations, no pending issues, no future review scheduled. Attached were revised maps, clean, corrected, unmistakable. My property lines were reaffirmed exactly where they'd always been. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed, except everything had. A second letter followed a week later, this one shorter, an apology, if you could call it that, carefully worded. Passive voice. Mistakes were made, processes were misunderstood. The board regrets any inconvenience. Inconvenience. I folded the letter and set it aside without responding. Not out of spite, but because apologies that arrive after consequences aren't meant for the person who was wronged. They're meant for the record, and the record was already complete. The real change didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly, the way the absence of noise does when you don't realize how much you've been carrying. One morning, I woke up and didn't listen for engines, didn't check the cameras first thing, didn't scan the road out of habit. I just made coffee. That was when I knew the vigilance had finally loosened its grip. I walked the property more slowly after that, not with purpose, without it. No measuring steps. No counting angles, just walking, letting the land exist without needing to defend it. The fence line stood where it always had, posts weathered but firm. The trees leaned the same way they always had, shaped by wind instead of regulation. The lake beyond the low rise reflected the sky without asking permission from anyone. The nature had never changed. I had. Neighbors waved more now, not out of obligation, not with curiosity, just normal, easy. The way people do when something unspoken has settled and no longer needs to be examined. One afternoon, the interim HOA president stopped by. Not officially, no clipboard, no agenda. I just wanted to say, he began, awkward but sincere, things should have been handled differently. I nodded. They are now. He looked relieved by that. People like closure when they don't have to earn forgiveness directly. We're revising some policies, he added, clarifying enforcement procedures, making sure boundaries are respected. I almost smiled. Good, I said. He didn't linger. Neither of us needed him to. The quiet returned gradually, layering itself back into the place like sediment. Nights grew deeper. Mornings stretched longer. Even the road seemed to soften, gravel settling into itself without interruption. But the quiet wasn't the same as before. Before, it had been innocence, assumption, the belief that distance alone was protection. Now, it was informed. I still kept the folder, not out of fear, but respect, for what documentation can do when it's treated like a discipline instead of a weapon. I didn't add to it anymore. I didn't review it. I just knew where it was. There's a difference between peace that's borrowed and peace that's earned. Borrowed peace depends on other people behaving well. Earned peace depends on knowing what to do when they don't. That distinction had changed me more than I expected. I thought about Karen sometimes, not often, not with anger, mostly with curiosity, about how close she'd come to believing she was untouchable, how easily confidence can turn into blindness when no one pushes back. She hadn't been evil, she'd been unchecked, and unchecked authority doesn't need malice to cause damage. I never saw her again. Her name faded from HOA emails, replaced by neutral signatures and committee titles. The board became quieter, more procedural, less performative. That was fine by me. The land didn't care who chaired meetings. One evening near the end of summer, I stood in the same place I'd stood months earlier, the edge of the drive where the road bends out of sight. The sun was low, light breaking through the trees in long, angled streaks that made everything feel suspended. This was where the cruiser had crossed the line. I remembered how it had felt then, the sudden tightening, the instinct to brace, the knowledge that something had shifted without my consent. Standing there now, I felt none of that. Just awareness. I realized something then that surprised me. I wasn't proud of how this ended. I was grateful for what it taught me. That silence isn't always safety. That politeness can be a strategy. that systems don't correct themselves without records, and that patience, real patience, isn't passive, it's active restraint. I went inside as dusk settled, the house greeting me with familiar sounds, wood cooling, air moving gently through open windows. I cooked dinner slowly, without distraction, letting the day close the way it wanted to. Later, sitting on the porch, I listened to the world settle again. Crickets, wind, distance. The quiet I'd come here for had returned, but I wasn't the same person who'd arrived expecting it to protect me. Now I understood its limits. Quiet isn't a shield, it's a space. And what you bring into that space, awareness, preparation, boundaries, that's what determines whether it holds. I didn't regret staying calm. I didn't regret documenting instead of shouting. And I didn't regret letting systems do what they were built to do, because in the end, nothing was taken from me. My land remained mine. My peace returned on my terms, and the truth stood exactly where it always does. Written down, time-stamped, and impossible to argue with. The road stayed quiet that night, and for the first time, I didn't mistake that quiet for ignorance. I understood it, and I respected it.